All right, welcome to another Spring Office Hours. My name is Dan Vega. With me, as always, is my friend and coworker, Deshaun. Today we have a
Good
special
morning.
guest, a friend and a coworker as well, Greg Turnquist. So this is episode number 9. Again, we've had, I think, one other guest on here. This is our second guest. We're excited to have Greg, and I'll just turn over to Greg and let Greg tell you a little bit about himself.
Well, hey everybody! Thanks for letting me come on to Spring Office Hours. Somebody says you want to come and talk on a live stream or a podcast about Spring. I'm like, yeah. If you don't know, I'm actually on the Spring team, a staff engineer, and I'm currently the lead for Spring Data JPA. What I like to call the third most popular project, probably in the whole Spring portfolio. So, and I say that not to boast or anything, but when people want to build apps, they always need to store data. At least I don't run into many apps that don't store data, and people are picking relational databases like 4 to 1, like heavy, big time. So I say that more as a joke, just because every day when I come check into work, I look at issues, and there's always more issues being open against Spring Data JPA. So that's that's the fun in here. But I love it. It's awesome.
Cool. So we'll talk more about Spring Data. I know you have some things to share on Spring Data, but before we get started, I just want to kind of talk about kind of the other side of some things that you're doing. I see your Twitter handle there at Spring Boot Learn. You do a lot of content creation, so I'd like you to kind of talk to us about that.
Yeah, I'd actually, it all stemmed from this idea that I launched a YouTube channel back in 2019 in the fall, and it kind of started as this idea of I'm about to start writing a book about Spring Boot. Maybe what would be cool is if I made a video or two about it, and that would, build the community or grow a community of people interested in Spring Boot that would be interested in a book like that. And and then I've reached a point now. I've made about 70 videos in the past 2.5 years, and now I'm at the
Wow.
point where I'm now in the book that I'm currently writing about Spring Boot that's coming out at the end of the year. I have links going back to video. Be like, okay, we just did a section on Spring security. Now here's a link. Go watch a video if you want more interactive content. So it's almost like gone the other way around.
Nice.
So I was
Um,
inspired by people. Oh, go ahead, man.
no, you brought up something there, because I create videos as well on YouTube, and one of the things that I've always heard from the people that I learned from, the Daryl Hughes of the world, they say the first 100 videos you make on YouTube are not going to be great. Yours are really good, so I'm wondering, do you find that statement to be true personally, or what you see from other creators? And if that is the case, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to start their own YouTube channel,
Well,
like Deshaun?
Sean, do it to Sean. Okay. Well,
Great advice.
there's this other guy I like to follow on YouTube, but well, it's a company now. It used to be a one-man job. Now it's like 11 creators called Think Media, and their slogan
Oh
is
yeah.
you just got to press record. So I was loaded up full of energy back in October of 2019, and I grabbed my iPhone and this little thing called a Gorilla tripod in my hand, and I went out in front of my house and I sat there like this and held it, and I just started talking about Spring Boot. And then I had my dog with me, so then I filmed a clip of me walking the dog because I'd seen this author out of the UK talk about how to become an indie book publisher, and he was doing the same thing. Only he went out feeding horses or something, and it was hilarious. So I said, well, if this guy can do it running around in the backwoods of rural England, why can't I do it in the neighborhood here? And I found out that lots of people are doing that. And I was like, if I just talk about Spring Boot, what I know, I like to say I know a bunch about that. And I found other people kind of found that enjoyable. So I was like, all right, let's go. Let's make number 2 and number 3 and so on and so forth. And it's just me, it's been fun.
Yeah, and I'll say this because we both create videos on Spring. I think like a lot of creators that get into this always worry about, well, Greg's already doing videos on Spring Boot. I shouldn't, I can't do that as well. And there's always that picture of somebody going down the grocery store aisle with the 50,000 different packs of water. Like there are always like options to
Yes.
choose from. And I always tell people, like, there may be the same message coming from different YouTube channels, but there's always a different messenger, and different people kind of vibe or click with different people, or different messages. So I don't know your thoughts on it, but I see somebody in the space talking about Spring Boot already as validation and a reason for me to want to do the same thing. And I don't look at you or anyone else in that space as competition. Like, we're all just doing the same thing, preaching the good word of Spring. So thoughts on that?
Well, there's actually a word out there called co-opetition, where it's
Yep.
like we are competitors, but not really. It's we're helping each other out, and to me it's proof that it's like, the whole world of Spring Boot or gardening or
Right.
I don't know, lumberjacking, whatever. There's they're huge. There's no one person owns that all. Maybe
Right.
Hollywood and movie roles are a very finite, gate kept asset, but talking about everyone's got a different flavor of Spring Boot, like you're saying, a
Yep.
different style. And the real mental mind shift for me was realizing I can go make a video about something that's the same topic that I made a video about a year ago. I can go
Yeah.
take it, put a new spin on it, put what's updated, use, since then I've learned a lot of things in styling or editing, and I can go remake the same kind of I made, and people enjoy that too, because I go to YouTube for a lot of entertainment, probably too much, and I find videos from the same people on the same topics. I go watch them again. I go watch the new stuff because it's fun. I enjoy it. And
Yeah.
this idea that things are saturated is, I think, a myth. So
I'll say
let's
that
do it.
early in my Spring Boot career, I was watching all of the videos that I could find, and it didn't matter if I'd seen it or if it was the exact same talk at a different conference. I was watching all of the videos that I could find, and I was trying to learn through osmosis. So there's some talks that some of the team has done that I have seen 20 times, 20 different versions of, right, over the days, and it was valuable, right? You hear things. It's not like you can't just hear something once and learn it. You need that reinforcement. We work with partners and customers, and we're helping their team, and we're saying these things over and over again, and repeating, and then finally they start repeating it back. Like, you have to hear things more than once. You don't learn it the first time you hear it. So yeah,
You don't need all this expensive gear. Like 10 years ago, maybe you did have to go buy a $2,000 camera to actually even just start thinking about it. Today, no. I actually know a creator that got to 100,000 subs in Thailand using an iPhone and a gimbal. And so we're
That's
talking,
crazy.
yeah,
what's an iPhone? $1,000 today, and a gimbal is
yeah.
$150.
Our good friend Kote, he did a lot of. I didn't
Yeah.
realize. I learned this like recently, that he did a lot of his, and I look at his videos as being really high quality. I like everything he's put out. So yeah, that's surprising. Not surprising. It
I
shouldn't be
started
surprising
doing
anymore.
stuff. They call it vlogging, like video blogging, vlogging. But so I was like, what do you call it if it's vlogging and coding? Loading? I mean, so
Well, and that's
Clog.
TikTok is really on the rise, and maybe people think of TikTok and it's like dancing videos, sure, but I think TikTok, one of the reasons that it's really become like popular is because there's less production into it, right? Like, there's a camera, and it's usually a phone, and it's just shooting, and it's like, I care about the content, not the hours of video production that you put into it.
I found some of my best content was I do a lot of coding live stream sort of after hours. I don't do it on the clock compared to certain people in this live stream, but I would do it after hours. And I linked up to YouTube, LinkedIn. People may not realize LinkedIn has live streaming support on it, Twitter, and a couple Facebook groups. So I'm like, let me just put it out there. Whoever wants to consume this content, I'm trying to put it into their hands as easily as possible. And then when I'm done, I actually pulled down the episode and pushed it to Anchor.fm, which is Spotify's podcast service. So they offer a free hosting solution, and then all the people can listen to the audio variation of it. So throw it out
Nice.
there, let people consume it, and get into the glory of Spring Boot.
I don't think I've ever streamed on Twitter. Did you find any like luck there?
I get people. What part of it is, I think it was like over a year ago, I decided to open a Twitter account that was specifically for my video
Yep.
content, and
Hmm.
you only get 15 characters. That's why it's not Spring Boot Learning, because that was not legal. And so
Yep.
um, I set it up, and I was like, this account, I'm just going to use it and talk about content creation and Spring Boot traffic and stuff. The other one's my general software engineering handle, and it's like grown to 1,200 or 1,300 people in like 1 year. And so I was like,
That's great.
I signed up for a StreamYard account. I said, well, let me link it up to here. Who knows how many of the people want to consume it from this platform? I don't know, but why not if there's no extra effort to put it there?
Cool. All right. Any more questions, Deshaun, on content?
I
Like I
took
said, I know
tons of
you're.
notes. I'm in the analysis paralysis phase right now.
Yep. Yep.
But this definitely helps. Thank you.
Cool. So let's switch gears to kind of the Spring world. Before we get into Spring Data, we have some exciting changes coming later this year with Spring Boot 3, Spring Framework 6. I know you've talked a lot about this on your live streams. Just curious, what are you excited about with those two new releases coming this year?
Well, the coolest thing to me is not the Spring Boot 3 / Spring Framework 6 per se, but the fact that all those are going to be re-leveled up to Java 17. And
Mm-hmm.
Java 17 has got a lot of cool stuff in it. And sometimes it's some of the little things, like you can use the vars. That's something maybe for a local chunk of code where you don't have to declare the type. But there's also where you can do this instance of pattern. It's an old cliche where it's like, okay, is this thing an instance of a subtype? And then inside the statement you downcast it. Well, they now have Java 17 brings a way to automatically downcast it by putting the type in the instance of check. And
Yep.
there's other cool stuff, like the list of the array.util.list has got Java.util.list has list.of. It makes it easier to go create a list, or there's also map.of, set.of. And it's actually a bona fide immutable list.
Yep.
I found out to my detriment when I didn't know that.
Yep.
But I'm starting to use more of that. Just slim it down and write more succinct code. And the other thing is, it's the JVM is faster on Java 17, and now they're I think they're starting to do like first Java 20. So this whole high-speed release train has been crazy, because I remember on the podcast, they kind of jeered at the slow rate releases came back way back in the days of Java 5.
Yeah, I've mentioned a couple times on our Spring One tour that the new release cadence is what I really think has propelled Java to, it was kind of stagnant for a while, and just kind of like changed the mindset of people going, oh wow, this is like moving fast and things are changing and things are getting better. And as you said, once we know somebody's using Spring Boot 3, I no longer have to go, well, what version are you on? I know that you're at least on 17, and you can take advantage of all the great language features. And like you said, performance out of the box, security out of the box. So I'm excited too to see the kind of community shift towards that.
Now, people that are relatively new to Spring may not be aware that Spring actually has a very long history of backwards compatibility. So, and / forwards compatibility. So they try to make it as simple as possible to just bump the version up to the newest one. If you've got an app built against Spring 2.7, the current supported version of the 2 that's out there, it should be minimal effort to just jump up to Spring Boot 3. Now you're going to have to jump up to Java 17 quite naturally, but this is where we spend a lot of effort, and we may solve a problem against the current main branch, but then we'll backport fixes, bug patches, things like that, to previously supported branches. Won't necessarily take new features to older versions, but we want to try to make it where the whole portfolio is well supported and it's not a major disruption. There are certain things we try to deprecate or give the signal that they are going to go out. Spring Boot has a policy of, they'll deprecate it, say, in the next version, and then the version after that, it's their discrimination to take it out, their discretion, I should say, to take that out. so you want to stay tuned to that, deprecation warnings. But if you go just in, to bump your app up, if you're stuck back on boot 2.3, just go, take it up to boot 2.4, then 2.5, then 2.6, and 2.7. And hopefully that's going to be a minimal effort for you to jump up to a currently supported version.
Yep. I guess I have one more question on that. So we look at it as like all these great new features are coming in Spring Boot 3, but you're an engineer working on the code that is going to ship in Spring Boot 3. Have you found anything to be like, wow, this was a big feat to make happen?
Ever heard of Hibernate? We're bumping up Spring Boot 3. One of the things that's going to pick up is a major rev of Hibernate called Hibernate 6, and so there's stuff that's moved around there. Oliver Dropbaum, the previous team leader for Spring Data, actually he spent several months to go through and make sure all of Spring Data JPA was working with that, because the boot team wanted to migrate up to that. And we've had to also interact with the Spring Batch team, which is they sit on top of relational database stuff, and so that's been some effort there. I was kind of like, thankfully that was not on my plate. The other stuff that's big is that our story for Spring Native, where it's kind of a cliche joke now that Java for 10 years has been chided as, well, gee, your startup time is horrible, 20 seconds to start up an app. But for a web server that stays up for a year, is that a big problem? Maybe not. But if you're running something like a AWS Lambda functions or something, then a 20-second startup time is the death knell. You want sub-second time. So being able to build a Spring app that runs on Graal VM with 20-second startup time is awesome. That's what Spring Native is about, making possible. But the glue code that has to be written to make that happen is like a nightmare in a sense. Some of the engineering and that's a consequence of adding it on at this phase. If that was something that had existed 10 or 15 years ago, maybe wouldn't be the challenge that it is. But we're all having to chip in on some of that stuff to help get that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it was I'm not sure if I saw it from Jurgen or maybe Michael, but I saw a slide somewhere that said like this was one of the biggest engineering feats the Spring team has had to take on, because when you talk about Spring Native and you want to be able to compile down to native, it's not just one piece of code, it's every single project needs to be able to support that. And so I feel for you guys, and I'm thankful we have a bunch of really smart people to take care of that. So,
and we can help. We can go grab the milestone releases and we can start toying around, and pull requests are welcome. I'm just saying, just throwing it out there.
Deshaun has been vigorously testing Spring Boot 3 native stuff. So
cool. That's part of it. Is there's I like that there's a message kind of. I think a lot of people are carrying it out on the social media that engineering is not just the typing the code and doing stuff. We need things like, we need people to write documentation, that test out stuff, that, there's a whole breadth of activity that happens with shepherding new releases out. And so, we need this too. We need people that consume the product, that are using it. 20 years ago, it was kind of a joke that don't ever upgrade to the .0 version of something, because that's the version that nobody has tested. Go to the .1 version. But I feel like it's not as bad today as maybe that was at the beginning of my career.
And things weren't moving as fast, right? 20 years ago, the idea, and I heard this last night, so it's kind of in the top of my head, like 2 releases a year, 4 releases. We used to send out CDs, right? You can't send out CDs every day, but now, like the release cycle, we figured some things out, and it's a different time.
I'm a big fan of the continuous integration, continuous deployment stuff. So that's really cool, because technically my first assignment ever was building other people's code, and so my job was to come in and run the code and to make sure nothing broke, and I started building my own tools by hand to have a cron job start that task at a minute past midnight. So when I would come in, it would be almost done. So I was like a human CI server. But anyway,
do you know what's really scary is we probably have some viewers who don't know what a CD is, Deshaun. That's where we're getting.
What was that? I can't.
Ouch. Oh boy.
All right. All right. So I want to
Well, on
shift
that
to
note,
Yep, on that note, I want to
Mhm.
shift to Spring Data. So before I know you have some slides you want to go through, and we're going to keep this as kind of like an open discussion. But before we get into that, Spring Data, for anybody who doesn't know, what is it? Why should they care about it? Just give us kind of the high overview of what it is.
Well, Spring Data is sort of your go-to solution in the Spring portfolio to get data. Okay, but what is that? What in the world does that even mean? It's something that we've learned is that when you try to create like an abstract interface to sort of capture all the behavior, what you end up with is a lowest common denominator. Okay, so if you start talking about what's a unified solution to talk to, a relational database through JPA or MongoDB or Redis, you end up with almost nothing. If you look for a united interface that would do that, because all those data stores work differently. They have different characteristics, and people pick them for different reasons. People want to go to Redis because it's a very high speed, efficient key value store fundamentally. People go to MongoDB for documents and documents within documents within documents and some of their aggregation pipeline stuff. And people go through JPA today for relational database stuff because partly that's just how we all think today. Is relational databases have a solid grounding and stuff. So what is something to be efficient about? Well, if I go to any of these data stores, I need access to their native operation. But one of the first things you need control over is resource management. So a lot of them have a ceremony of how do I connect to it and open a connection and open, what's the dance to link up to it, and then finally run my actual business-based, query, for lack of a better term. And then how do I close the connection correctly so that I'm not leaking resource stuff? And so that's one of the things that Spring has been big on from the get-go, from back in the early days. Um, but we started noticing, we would notice things like a lot of queries are very simple. It's like, let me query this table or let me query this document. Just give me all the entries in that table or document. Or, maybe with a crude filter on it applied. Just let me filter down and find everybody in this table that has the last name of Baggins, or let me look and find all the documents that link to Baggins, that kind of thing. And so in that sense, do you really need to be writing that custom query when we can write it, we can denote it in the name of a method signature. So you can write this find by last name. And if the interface with this definition in it also has the generic parameters to connect to, employee. I've got an employee type with a first name and a last name field. Why can I not do find by last name with an argument? And that's kind of one of the things that Spring Data does. It can go read this method signature, you put it in the correct place, parse it, and write that query for you. So you're like, well, good. That takes a load off my shoulders. Before I came to the Spring team, I worked on a system where I wrote by hand over 200 queries to manage event correlation data. And a lot of the queries were very cut and dry like that. They were very simple. So I wrote them one time and never looked again. But imagine not having to write 80% of your queries and instead focus your effort on that crazy query that joins 20 different tables, but the business office runs that only once a month. And so I can spend my effort honing and making that more efficient. And so Spring Data lets you do this kind of repository-based solution with derived queries like that. But it's not the only thing it does. It also has options of, imagine you're filling out, like a customer has a filter on a page where you're listing all these employee objects. Somebody wants to type in a filter box. This time they're filtering on first name, or they're filtering on last name, or first name and role, but the criteria fluctuate. So we have a concept called query by example. We're just grab all the fields from the search box, stick it into a Pojo object, and hand it over to Spring Data to query based on that, and it will filter based on the fields that aren't null. So again, no need to write the query. It's very straightforward what it's doing, and it's pushing functionality right into the user's hands, and it's also type safe and secure from attack. And then it also comes with that same resource management baked in. And it's just other ideas like that We don't need a common unified interface between all the things, just all the data stores that are supported by Spring Data kind of have this feature. So it makes it easy to rise above thinking too heavily of the data store and instead shift to a business oriented mindset of what do I need to do to serve the business in use cases and stuff.
Yeah, and so for me, everything Spring does across kind of the portfolio of projects is take that thing that's kind of complicated, abstract that away for me, and just give me kind of a simple paradigm across my application to work with. And Spring Data is no different. Like I don't want to write my own JDBC code, like low level JDBC. If you're doing that these days, you're wasting your time on something that it could be better spent somewhere else. So yeah, just being able to start up an app and go, I don't need to worry about this right away. I can connect to a database and get a list of customers from there without having to spend days getting that CRUD information going. So pretty cool stuff.
And that was kind of a working theory that was sort of bubbling up back in 2014, and then they released Spring Boot. That was when the first release of Spring Boot went out, which was 8 years ago. And that clicked with a lot of people of let me get above this low level infrastructure management and API nonsensory, and let me rise up to actually build the features that I'm trying to build, because people went crazy for Spring Boot. Like, oh my gosh, I don't need to think about data access or something. It's just like pow.
Well, and that's what a lot of web frameworks were doing at the time, right? Like your Ruby on Rails. It was like, I don't need to worry about that stuff. I want to quickly write an app and worry about the business logic, not all that low level infrastructure. So
I mean, there's a reason you would see these startup companies that would have 5 people in them and one person is the app developer. There's a reason they were using Ruby on Rails, because
right.
they needed to turn production fast.
Yep. Cool. So that was a good introduction. You want to go through some slides now?
Yeah, let's have at it.
Let's throw this on here and switch over to that. Cool.
All right. It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your relational database is? It's a title I kind of cribbed off somebody I knew in college that had done a presentation on GPS systems, and it was, they called it, it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your tractor is? So they talked about automated tractoring systems that can be operating off GPS, and I always remembered that. I don't know if their project was any good, but the title caught my attention like that. So there's something I mentioned earlier on when we were going at it, which was that relational databases have dominated the landscape like 4-1. And what I mean by that is we have data in that when people go build a new app, if you go to start.spring.io, that magic site that we're always seeing Josh Long using in his cool presentations to whip up a project in 5 minutes or less, people without fail need to store data. I mean, there may be an app here or there that doesn't, but by far they do. And they almost are always picking a relational database because that's where the industry is. After 15 years of NoSQL databases, dozens and dozens of them, people mostly need relational database. They don't, and that's not a slight against one party or the other. It's just kind of the nature of things. If you don't need one, then, or if you need a different type of data, that's fine. But this is just sort of the reality we're in. And that's because apps live and breathe data. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say here. Is that, in fact, I made a video where this is sort of my opening tagline was apps live and breathe data. And I went into some of the query options that you have with Spring Data itself. I've always thought that an app without data is not really an app yet. So it's more like an idea. Or I can mock out or scaffold some web pages and stuff and start working on the look and feel. But until I hook it up to the real data, it's just a stub concept. So what do you do? I mean, what happens when you come to check out Spring? Maybe you're watching this live stream right now and you're like, I've been hearing about Spring. Let me check it out. This is my first place I'm going to go look into. What happens when you check out the portfolio and you're like, I want to work with a relational database? And what you find is this: you see something called JDBC Template. Like, okay, but I've heard of JDBC. It's for persisting data, so I guess that's a tool that'll let me do that. But then I hear there's this other thing called Spring Data JPA. I've also heard people mention JPA. I'm not sure what the difference is between that and JDBC. And well, wait a minute, there's a Spring Data JDBC. Now what do I do now? Because there's JDBC Template and Spring Data JDBC. This is getting confusing. And what in the world is R2DBC? I mean, that
R2D2.
you know, logo here, but if you go to r2dbc.io, you may see an R2D2 inspired theme. And watch us get demonetized. So what the heck is that even? For these, oh, come on now, this is getting ridiculous. So Spring Data R2DBC, oh gosh. I heard about this website that would randomly throw together buzzwords and like Spring stuff, and it was hilarious. Abstract singleton proxy factory creator, something, like that. So I mean, what do? Throw your hands up and say, okay, forget it. I'm going back to Ruby on Rails. Well, what you pick and what you do, it depends on what you're trying to do. I love this because I actually did a live stream where I just sit there and talked about it's okay to say it depends. People answer questions with this and then they feel guilty. And I'm like, do not feel guilty because we live in a complex world. So
that's my go-to. Whenever anybody asks someone and I'm not sure yet, I go, it depends, and then I ask more questions.
And my friend in Nashville, he's a very high quality coder, is also a software skeptic. So he's the person that said, he inspired me to say it's okay to say it depends. So first of all, why don't we talk about exactly what are these things, JDBC versus JPA versus R2DBC? Because if we can understand what these are, maybe we can understand what these toolkits are and better understand what to pick and when. So JDBC is the acronym for Java Database Connectivity. And if you're fresh and new to software engineering, gear up because the world is full of acronyms. Okay. JDBC is an old spec. I mean, it's been around like back, at least back to Java 1.4, the last release of Java that people would refer to with a 1 dot prefix. After that is Java 5, Java 6. I'm on Java 17, which I think it's supposed to be technically 1.17 because there's never been a Java 2, but probably the specs even say 17. So this is an old spec, and if you look at it and if you read how it works, the way you have to open a connection, open a cursor, submit a query, skim the results, close result set, close connection, that whole song and dance, it's a pain in the neck, but it's not JDBC's fault. Because if you go to any other technology from that era, whether it's Python tool or whatever, C, C++, they all do the same song and dance because that is what relational databases demand. So don't blame JDBC. That's just the way it worked. And they codified it so everybody could at least have a common set of APIs and not keep rolling the same solution. So what is this JPA thing? Well, JPA is the Java Persistence API. And I always chuckle when you have one acronym expand out to another acronym. So it's the Java Persistent Application Programming Interface. And I've seen 3 and 4 level acronyms when I used to work in government contract. But JPA is essentially the standardization of what was called Hibernate. Hibernate, something that arose back in the 2000s as this idea of we're burning up way too much time basically mapping tables to Java objects. It's like if I've got a table called employee and it's got a column named first name and a column called second or last name and a column called role, and I've got a Java object called first name and last name and role, why do I have to keep gluing that together in the 50 queries that I'm writing in JDBC, for crying out loud? I mean, come on. That's absurd. We're supposed to be engineers making stuff easier, and it seems like talking to the database is harder. So they developed Hibernate, and Hibernate was wildly successful. People were like, oh yeah, that is cool. So by going into your POJO definition and you create what's called an entity, essentially you add it started off as XML. In the XML, I can define this field in the Java record maps this column in this database table. And I mean, that's kind of the essence of where it started. And when Java 5 came along with annotations, they made it where you could just do all that 100% with annotation. But if I define how the objects and the tables link together, then I can write a query in a common dialect that all databases will understand. That gets me away from writing SQL. It gets me away from writing data store specific SQL. Something maybe people don't realize is they may start off with a particular database. Maybe I started with Oracle. Other people may start with Postgres or MySQL. And the fun comes when you make the first time you go to another project that's on a different database and you're trying to figure out, why doesn't my SQL query work? Because the SQL standard, and I should say standards, there's more than one standard. I don't have my XKCD graphic talking about the problem of having 6 standards. But there is an ANSI SQL standard out there, but it has holes in it. So every database vendor, they implement the standard, but then they have more. And they have more features and more options because specs evolve slowly and systems evolve quickly. So the idea with JPA was you could at least have the thing could make, you could tell it, here's my JPA query. I'm talking to Postgres. You handle it. I should have said Hibernate there. It started as Hibernate, and eventually the Hibernate people basically took what they had come up and crafted, and they turned it into a standard spec. And so now Hibernate is the reference implementation for JPA, or Java Persistence API. And this again lets you rise kind of like one level up. So let me move up a level away from writing that crazy JDBC code all the time. Handwriting.
Those row mappers were a pain in the butt to write. Every time you needed some, especially when you had 20 fields in a POJO. Oh, that was just.
We're not going to talk about EJBs. But what about EJBs?
No.
That's just another acronym we don't need to bring into this conversation.
Part of my cool origin story is that before I came to the Spring team, I was working on this government contract, but we were not using Java. We were using something called Forte 4GL. And don't confuse it with Forte for Java. This is a startup company in Oakland, California. They got acquired by Sun Microsystems, and their code, their development practice and language was so incredibly efficient, they stole the name, they bought the name and reapplied it to their other products like Forte for Java stuff. And the Forte for Java had absolutely nothing to do with Forte for GL.
I haven't heard Forte in a long time, but I know that I used it. So yeah, throwback. There's been a lot of those lately.
You didn't use what I used, which was that original product. They had their own language called Tool, transactional object-oriented language. So you could sit there and write a select statement, and you could select star into my widget that's going on the screen. And I mean, it was cool. It had distributed support built in. It had its own runtime container. It was write once, run anywhere. And Sun Microsystems acquired them because they were clearly competitive. So, and then they did the project 6 months after our contract started. So the amount of support I could get quickly vanished to 0. So anyway, the get derailed here, but the whole idea was let's just elevate things up a level. Let's just move. And so I basically worked on that, and I kind of sidetracked the whole EJB thing. And so EJBs had gotten sort of unpopular by the time I joined the Spring team, and I'd also dodged JavaScript that whole time too, because they had their own thick client app stuff that I worked with. So while Dan was having fun probably learning every JavaScript toolkit, I was learning
Not even jQuery?
I realized I needed to start boning up on jQuery when I was kind of early on in the Spring team. I was like, I need to know some of what does jQuery do? And then I remember talking to a teammate. I will not name him without his permission, but
I said or her.
Oh, him. But anyway, I went and said, what do you think about jQuery? And he said back to me, if you have more than 4 lines of jQuery in your code, you're doing it wrong. And
Yeah,
those are words to live
I
by.
I didn't like JavaScript early on, but I had to learn it. I needed to know it. And then jQuery came along, and I was like, oh, this is fun to write again. Like this is not painful. So yeah, that kind of changed everything for me as far as JavaScript goes. And now I'm a huge fan. So
I like the.
Oh,
I was
wait.
like React.js. React to me was cool because that was again lifting you up from gluing together stuff with jQuery, looking down here in the DOM for something with jQuery, and instead it just said, let's just lay out all these components, and based on state of stuff, I can change what it is and let the framework
yep,
go update the DOM.
yep.
I think we have a question from somebody that might have joined
Sure.
late. I have a question, please. What method do you recommend to implement a dynamic query with JPA based on the presence or not of fields in my search filter?
That's a perfect question because this is perfectly what query by example excels at. In fact, we even added, I implemented the addition of query by example to Spring Data R2DBC because it essentially lets you grab those fields that are in the search box or whatever that on that GUI entry, and you can basically make them optional on the web controller. Your Spring web controller, you can be optional on the fields that are coming in. So essentially that translates to, or call them nullable. Okay, so you can get a null. So you just all the fields, copy them into a Pojo object, and then there's this API example.of that object. And by default, Spring Data's query by example will search based on which fields are not null. Now, out of the box, its default is to do a complete match on each field. So it's this field equals that and that field, but you can go in and tweak the probe that you configured to say, I want it to be an and, or I want it to be an or I want the matching to be
Partial.
a contains, not an equal. So you can make it each field's a partial match. And that actually lends itself to, you can go write a universal search where it's just one field like a Chrome browser. I'm going to enter this thing and just take that value and paste it in to all the fields and use query by example and say, I want to make it a partial match. If it's this or this or this or this, then go with it. And so to me, that lets you make that dynamic search without you writing, because otherwise you have to go write a combinatorial explosion of finder methods to match all.
Right. That's what I was going to get to. At what point do you like say, I want to write this method in my interface called find by first name and last name, find by first name and last name, or email address. Like at some point when you're writing those, is that a signal to you to go, all right, we need to move over to kind of query by example?
Yes.
Or just start with query.
Well, that's what, to me, the when I first learned about query by example, I was implementing that feature for Spring Data R2DBC. I kind of caught on to what it was doing, and then part of me was thinking like my other teammates had not really shared it heavily with other people, and I was in the middle of writing a book, and I'm sitting there like building. I already had the idea to go have a search box, and then it like dawned on me. I'm like, wait a minute, this is what query by example does. It fits to this thing, because if you're in a circumstance where like I don't know what fields are and are not filled, the user is picking that, and it's going to change every time. I realize that's what query by example does.
This, I think, qualifies. We were having a conversation not too long ago about some of the things that are really, really valuable in the Spring ecosystem that maybe we forgot about. Like, what are some of those golden secrets, some of those recipes that just makes life so much easier? And I think this definitely qualifies as one. Yep. That every system, or not every system, lots of systems need that feature, and Spring and Spring Data just makes it easy. You don't have to think about that. I could think of at least a dozen projects that I worked on where, how are we going to implement search?
And sometimes we are trying to shove something in. You feel like I'm fighting this API. I'm trying to shove it in. Well, maybe you need to pause and think. Is there an easier way? Because sometimes you don't need any of this. Sometimes
there's got to be an
what
easier
I need
way.
is I'm fighting the utility that was provided. Maybe you just need to sidestep it and roll the SQL directly and just shove it into manager with what you're needing to do in this situation.
I'm very glad you brought this up, Deshaun, because selfishly, Nate and I are giving a talk at KCDC in a couple of weeks on Spring recipes. common solutions to common problems. And I think I'm going to go ahead and
this
add
deserves to
query
be
by
there.
example in there.
Yep.
So cool.
So,
Not to shift, but I did see one other question that I don't know I can answer specifically, but it says, is there anything that Django does better than Spring? So again, I get this question a lot, like, hey, I'm using this framework and this language. Why would I move to Spring? You know, and again, if your team is using a specific language and framework and it's working for you and it does all the things, great. I don't see a need to move. If your team is a Java team and for whatever reason you're using Django, then maybe there is a reason to move. But a lot of these frameworks for me kind of all accomplish the same things. They go about it different ways. But they all, if you need to build a web application, I hear Python and Django is a great solution for that. So that's kind of my answer. I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
hey, Python's always a cool answer. I mean, I dig Python. I read Mark Pilgrim's book long ago on, and I can't even remember what the title of it is on Python, but it's like just a walkthrough book about how mind-numbingly simple Python is to solve stuff. So I really dig Python.
Except the white space.
The white space in the
Shut up. No. I like that. That is one you want to get controversial. That's the bomb to throw in the middle of the conversation. But to me I was cool with it, but I can understand people's aversion to that. But and after that, later we'll be talking tabs versus space.
Whoa! Why are you? We're trying to have a normal conversation here.
This is a civil conversation.
But
I'll add up until now.
Python is what TCL wanted to be. Okay, I don't know if you even know what TCL or Tickle is, but that Tickle was built with this idea that we could wrap C APIs with a scriptable language. That's what it. But it grew enough sentience that nobody did that. They just used Tickle for what it was, and in that case, it's ugly. Unless you're using expect, then there's nobody that does what expect does in Tickle. But
Greg, we haven't had a lot of conversations, but I spend a lot of time with Raspberry Pis, and up until Spring Native, the one thing that was I could always argue is that Python ran better on Raspberry Pi, but not anymore. Not anymore. So is there anything that Django does better than Spring? You asked me a year or so ago, I would have said, yes, it runs better on Raspberry Pi. But now the answer is no. No, there's nothing that Django does better than Spring.
Raspberry Pi, that's cool.
Yes.
And it's, I wrote an article recently. I have a link. You can go to springbootlearning.com/medium. I wrote an article that's actually generated a lot of action because I picked a controversial title: when to not use Spring Boot. And part of it's like, if you just joined a team and the team that you joined just spent 3 months of meetings and email threads picking out to use the Django, the decision at that stage may have been made, and it's frankly it's kind of unprofessional and rude to sit there and say, hey, let's go to Spring Boot. Okay, maybe in 2 years' time when they come back and they want to revamp or they want to build the next tool, that may be the time to insert your opinion on Spring Boot. And this may be the time for you to knuckle down and learn what the system does. Okay, so, and Django's got power. I think I've seen newspapers and other systems have built systems on top of Django. So it's no vaporware toy either. So.
Yeah, Fuel Snable's talking about Python and startup and performance, and that's what I was talking about with Spring Native, and especially what's coming up with Spring Framework 6 and Spring Boot 3. The startup stuff has been addressed. It takes a lot of work, but with Java 17 rebase and the addition of GraalVM and the native AOT ahead of time compilation, the startup times for Spring apps for large Spring apps that include the JVM and all the good stuff, is sub-second.
And Greg mentioned it earlier, but startup time is not always the biggest thing, right? Like there are a lot of workloads. We've talked about this on the Spring One tour, Deshaun. That there are a lot of workloads and applications that are right on the JVM. Garbage collection has really just done amazing things in the last 20 years, and there are workloads that are better, so what that it takes a few more seconds to start up. As Greg said, it may run for a year, and the JVM is just a really great runtime. So it just depends on what you're doing.
That's a good throwback. It
Yeah.
depends.
And up until Spring Boot kind of emerged on the scene, I mean, I understand people's penchant for, I got a startup company. I need to be putting code updates out daily. So I understand people's desire to go to Ruby on Rails, because my goodness, you could actually build your multi-million dollar startup on Rails like that, back in the day. Because I mean, Java, the JVM is sort of like a truck if you want to compare other platforms as being a car. So truck, they can carry a bigger load, but they move slower. People are like, why is our trucking system built on trucks? Trucks drive on average slower than cars, and it's because trucks haul more load. You can fit more in them, and this is the reason why you pick reactive versus imperative. Imperative programming, maybe we all know this and stuff. It's not, reactive programming isn't faster, but it may be a lot more efficient at the way it's using your current resources. So I can use imperative. I may need 10 times as many instances running in the cloud, and my cloud bill may go through the roof. But if I go to reactive, with a little thought and consideration, I may be able to trim my cloud bill, and then the CEO may give me a certificate at the end of the year as an award for doing.
So you're saying it depends.
To the cafeteria.
It depends.
Yep, it depends.
Excellent. Good questions.
So I know people are itching to let's get a little more of this content out there. So what is R2DBC? That one popped up, and I could understand a lot of people like, what in the world is that? Well, R2DBC is the reactive relational database connectivity specification. So just go after the stream's over, go home and say that 3 times fast. And it was a spec that was initially designed by the Spring team, and it started about 4 years ago. And it was the idea of, there's a growing interest in reactive programming. We were just talking about it with metaphors of cars and trucks, and people want to use reactive programming. And reactive programming lends itself to functional programming, which I won't delve into right now. But 80% of the people want to talk to relational databases and current relational database drivers. Something you may not know is that JPA uses JDBC. When you write a JPA query, under the hood, it gets translated into the local dialect of SQL and piped through a JDBC connection into the database itself. And those two specs, JPA and JDBC, are blocking. They have blocking, they wait, they submit something to the driver, and they sit there and wait, and they hold the thread up. And reactive programming, as your 2-sentence summary, you need to let go of the threads. And essentially, you're putting work on queues. You're like, here's some work to do. I'm going to create a stack of work. Do this, and then do this, then do this. When the results come back from this, map it onto this, and then put it back on the queue. And under the hood, the reactive-based programming is managing it for you. It manages the threads for you. 3 out of 4 jobs may be on one thread, but the 4th job may be picked up by a different thread. And so JDBC and JPA come to a grinding halt when you try to do reactive programming through them. Something we've learned in 30 years of research and analysis is that if you have 4 cores on a machine, a thread pool of 4,000 doesn't get you any further. It's in fact, we also learned this empirically through JavaScript toolkits, where you have 1 thread in the browser. Where if you take a more reactive approach, where instead of thinking in terms of I need lots of threads, instead I can have as many threads as I can have actual physical workers on the CPU, you can actually have scalable solutions. But you need to break apart this idea of, I'm going to submit a job and wait for the answer and tie up this thread, when the thread could be going and doing other work. So we basically went and wrote a spec to talk to relational databases, but with a reactive paradigm in mind. So we use JDBC as kind of inspiration, and we sort of wrote this from scratch. And we've been putting it out there since then. So and it's recently reached, I think, a 1.0 status. So it's been a lot of development, but now there's other community members contributing stuff. So we have support for MySQL, Postgres, I wrote the support for H2, which, my goodness, was that ugly. But anyway,
I know
other
Oracle's in
stuff
there.
other stuff we learned is that JDBC has one interface to rule the world. So the spec that driver writers write against and the spec that application developers write against is one and the same. So there's stuff that they put, they put into the spec that maybe should have been here, but they got here. So there's a certain amount of leakage in there, or there's certain stuff that driver writers have had to implement over and over and over because they didn't put that in the spec. There are certain patterns repeated. So we made a point to kind of have there's sort of a two-layer effect here. So this is what drivers write, this is what app developers code against. And to go hand in hand with that, we simultaneously worked on a Spring Data R2DBC version of that. So that's like your lesson in specs here for today. So you're ready to go take your pop quiz for your university exam now. So to talk about these toolkits, so I wanted you to understand what the things are. What means do we have at our disposal to connect to databases, particularly relational databases, and that's what they are. So now with that seated, maybe we have a better understanding of what these tools are. And the first one on the list was JDBC Template. Now, if you didn't know about this yet, you start looking for templates in Spring Framework, Spring Boot, Spring Data JPA, Spring this, Spring that. You're going to find the template pattern in all kinds of places. And Dan was hinting at that earlier, that sometimes there's operations that it doesn't need to be hard. In 2008, Rod Johnson's opening message at the Spring Experience was, Spring is here to reduce Java complexity. I think Java had been very good at let's go capture standard behaviors people are doing and put them into the spec, but sometimes it took patterns like JDBC, for example, and their style, and it just sort of froze them into, this is how Java's going to do it. Java's just going to talk to the database the way the database says we should. And JDBC Template was like, hold on, what are developers doing all the time? Submit a query, iterate over the results. That's it. That's all they need to do. You talked about having to write that nasty row mapper thing. Well, JDBC Template says, okay, here's an API to run, JDBC Template .query. Here's a SQL query, and here's an object, an instance of an object called employee mapper. And I write one time the code to map this column to this field. And then I can write 50 different queries with this template, and that's all I need to feed it is that instance, that object, that row mapper. I don't need to deal with open a connection, open a result set, open a cursor, whatever, and then closing that, because the problem people were running into with the standard solutions was, I'm going to write this query, I'm going to do the manual process, I'm going to open the connection, run the query, close the connection, and then I'm going to get to the second one, open connection, run query, close connection. And by the end of the day, and you're writing your 10th query, I'm going to open connection, I'm going to run query, okay, it's time to go home. And then you forgot to put the close operation in there. And then the next day you write 10 more, and by, after you've written 100 of these operations, 3 or 4 of them you forgot to do the close operation. And so you don't find out about it until 3 weeks later when the database crashes because of there's no more cursors left. And you're scratching your head saying, what happened? And you track down and find the first one, and you fix it. You don't realize there's 2 more. And the whole idea of JDBC Template is, why does a developer need to manage that mental model? And this is also before we had the try resources thing in Java, because today you could arguably beat that thing with native constructs. This whole idea of I need this block of code to run inside a closable object. But what did that take us? 8 years to get to that? Longer. So JDBC Template is like, let's ease talking SQL to the database and focus on what the developer needs. There's like a couple operations, and that's it. So if you're having to write I need to write this query, it's very simple, I'm going to do it, you can always go to JDBC Template and do that.
Yeah, and this is really a great intro for someone who's new to Spring, right? But maybe they've worked in another stack and they're used to writing SQL. JPA is a lot for someone to kind of take on right away. So if you need to get into an application, connect to a database, write some SQL, this is a great intro before having to dive into something like JPA. Because I'm used to writing SQL, I can go write my select statements and I can get some data out of the database.
It depends on where you're coming from too, right? I've been in a position where, yeah, I was comfortable writing the SQL queries, and the database made it easy. So oh yeah, I know how to do that. And JDBC template was easier. I've also been in the position where JPA was easier, or Hibernate was easier. But then at scale, things get more complex. It's easy with JPA to add children, and JPA is going to handle those queries, but sometimes those queries aren't the most optimal, and it becomes harder to debug. So at scale, we needed to go the other way. We needed to go from JPA, the high abstraction, down to JDBC template, so we could get the help, and we could help identify where those issues were, where we needed to optimize better, and we could pull in DBAs that had more expertise around what's actually happening in that database system. So we went. I've seen it go both ways, changing the abstraction layer depending on what's needed at the time.
And and that's a good point too. Spring's all about bringing options to developers. It's like, here's your choices, and you may know the best context of what to pick. So I'm not going to tell you, always use JDBC template or never use it. Use it for what works.
And that's the mistake. That's the mistake that I've made. That's the mistake that I see the most, is like, oh, well, we're going to use JDBC template. Oh, but it doesn't do this, and we can't do this fast. You don't have to pick one across the whole board. You have these options, and that's the biggest mistake I've seen repeated over and over again, no matter what the technology is, even outside of Spring Data. It's like, oh, well, we're going to do it this way. And oh, no, we use this thing to do all the things. You don't have to do it that way.
And you may not know this, but if you go to project and you put in Spring Data JPA, which throw this slide up here, if you have a project, a Spring Boot project, and you've pulled in the Spring Boot Data JPA starter, it pulls in Spring Data JPA, but JDBC template is also in there. You can auto wire a JDBC template into any Spring service that you have, and you can just drop down to that level. Because you may be like, okay, over in this subsystem, I'm having to work with these relationships and all this stuff. But over here, gosh, I've got to write that mind-numbing query that joins 20 tables. And it's like, and so, choose what works. So Spring Data JPA is the thing that now gives you, gives your app wings to fly. No, it gives you access to JPA, but it gives you there. And the whole thing is that we found out when they had what ended up in the standards, you have this thing called an entity manager. And so if you're writing pure JPA, you have to go interact with it, and you need to go learn it. And it's not, I don't know, it's not simple, or it's not there. It's not hard, but there's a orchestrate. There's a dance to using it right.
Different.
I don't want to besmirch people for having built something. It's a cool toolkit, and but you need to understand how it works. And the concept of JPA was like, well, gee, do I really need to go manage all that mapping that we were just talking about? And I mean, I need to manage that. And so the kind of the going in the first 5-minute promise of Hibernate JPA is that I can get away from that if I can just structure the entities right. And that's kind of true. And then it's kind of absolutely not true, because the further you keep going in, you can reach, the ninth circle of JPA, where you kind of do have to understand what relational databases are doing, or you're going to write, or you're going to do it wrong. And it's almost like you can't get away from understanding what relational databases do.
I was laughing out loud. That I like that. I'm gonna keep that one tucked in. I have two new ones. Spring Data JPA gives your apps wings to fly. Beware the ninth circle of Spring Data JPA.
I said the ninth circle of JPA.
The ninth circle of JPA.
I was like, JPA. This is what JPA does. So, so the whole idea with Spring Data JPA is let's one of the paradigms in the Spring Data projects is called aggregate root, and this is something pulled out of domain-driven design. This whole idea of like, let's have an ecosystem of here's all the objects that are related, and so draw a big circle around there. What are the operations related to that? So there's a sense of your aggregates are where you come in and interact with. You can have these parent-child relationships. So typically you deal with through the parent, and it's interesting because that's like one of the books that has actually weathered the test of time very well, because it's not so technology specific as concept specific. Domain driven design by Eric Evans. So
it was like 2004, huh?
Yeah, it is.
That's been around for a while. Great book. Yeah.
So that's a book, you can go buy it today and read it and have a sudden world's better understanding of what Spring Data is doing. But you don't have to have read it to be able to leverage it.
And I would even go as far as to say as it's a really big book. I'm not saying don't read the whole book. It's a very good book. But the first like 4 to 6 chapters are really the heart and meat of what you need to learn around like DDD. So, but read the whole book if you have the time.
But Spring Data, and actually what's funny is the first Spring Data module had nothing to do with JPA. It was with Neo4j, the graph database, was where they actually experimented first. There used to be a JPA template in Spring Framework. Long ago, if you go Googling, you can find that in older versions, but they've since deprecated and removed that because they expect you to work directly with the session entity or whatever, the entity manager. But in Spring Data JPA, the Spring Data, the idea is you can define an interface, and we'll call it, it's a repository. And you don't have to extend anything from Spring. You can essentially define an interface, define finders, finder methods, find by last name, find by first name with parameters, and Spring Data will go scan that. It will go scan that, and then part of it, what you have to do is you have to declare the entity type through a generic parameter. So at the root of Spring Data, we have this project called Spring Data Commons that all the modules point back to. There's a repository interface with nothing inside, and it has a generic parameter, which is the entity type and the key type, the primary keys type. Whether it's a long, an integer, it could be a POJO type, but basically you extend that. So, and it's got so then you can start writing stuff. It'll start parsing it. Spring Data will then, when the app starts up, it'll see your interface, it'll scan it and say, aha, I know what that is. And then it kind of wraps the thing with a proxy. And inside the proxy, it's able to switch and route the method into the correct implementation. So whether it pipes you into the query by example method, or it routes you over here to what I call query derivation, where they parse the name of the method, or there's options where you can put named, you can what's called a named query, where you actually write the JPQL or the SQL stuff in a XML file that gets scanned and read in, and then that's linked to the method through an annotation or setting. But basically, and what you do is in each module, we have things like Spring Data Commons has something called CRUD repository, where we just have we've just pre-made methods that work. Find all, find by ID, delete all, delete by ID, exists, count. We have counters, so those are the main actions you get to do.
But Greg, in the CRUD repository, we've returned this thing called an iterable. I just don't like working with iterables.
Go there. So what Spring Data Commons does is it's kind of trying to walk the fine line between what's practical for end users. How many of us use iterables every day? Very small, and what's going to serve all the data types, all the data sources or modules, I should say. And right. Some of these data stores can actually take advantage of scrollable cursor result sets. So there could be an idea that your data store may have only fetched, the results may be this big, but it's only pulled this much into memory, and it's able to move along. And that is what the iterable pattern is. So in that context, it's iterable. But if you use CRUD repository's immediate sub interface that is in Spring Data JPA called JPA repository, that method is overridden with a finder that returns a Java list. And I like to mention that root repository with nothing inside it, because you're always free to either use the ones that have been kind of pre-baked, versus you can just go create your own. You can go create your own base interface. In fact, I know somebody that's over in Europe that built the system, and he baked his own variant as a root repository, like his own version of CRUD repository that all of his repositories extend. So you can make it where every return type is string, not a string.
Yeah, and this is a great use case. I know a lot, people have asked me the question before: how do I write read-only repositories? And And that's it. Just extend the repository that has no methods in it instead of extending CRUD repository, and just write whatever read methods you want in there. Find all, find by ID, find by first name and last name. Now you have a read-only repository that particular controllers may use. And then, yeah, just a great way to do that. So cool.
Now, there has been a lot of feedback over the years, and we actually, man, I remember dialing into a chat to discuss this heavily when I was in a parking lot. This is the fun of, working through the internet. We had a Spring Data team meeting, and we really discussed it heavily about iterable or list. Should we move it to list? Should we move it to iterable? It's like the idea is, I think the idea is the iterable lets you do this thing. I think that like JPA, we know that Hibernate and Eclipse Link, the two concrete implementations we support, we know that they hand you back a list. It's already, all the data's already been fetched. Okay. That's one of the reasons why JPA repository has it. So like, which should we do? Should we go ahead and move it there? Well, what if we start supporting another one that doesn't have it? We could never walk that back. So we made the decision to add, it's called list CRUD repository. That's at least very close to it. But so we have a variant of it that is list based. So that is, you can pick up and run with that and use that instead.
And that just extends the regular CRUD repository, so you get all those methods too.
Yep. It extends that and then overrides the ones with iterable and places in the list. So that seemed like a good compromise. We've had other people come to us and offer a dozen different. Can we have a stream CRUD repository solution? And we said no.
You can make your own really easily.
Roll your own. That's the night we're going to close the ticket and say, that's a fantastic idea. I think that's best left to you. So you go manage that.
Yep.
And then with a big smile on your face. So that is, if you want to move into the land of, I want Hibernate to manage it, right? And maybe this is what you're familiar with. You may run into systems that do this. Spring Data JPA gives you access to JPA, and JPA is incredibly powerful. But whereas you get away from writing data store specific queries, that is like a huge plus, because it is I remember working on an Oracle database and then going and writing. I built a super slick query that somebody needed, but this was a business manager, and they needed it in their Microsoft Access database that talked to the same engine on the backside. And I pasted my query in, and it absolutely broke because string concatenation is not a standard feature. And I was like, so JPA lets you rise above that, but what it does not let you do, if someone's telling you this, it's wrong, is that it doesn't get you away from understanding what one-to-many relationships are, or many-to-one. And I had this, senior software engineer at my previous company that he knew Oracle inside and out. He knew relational databases, and he was very skilled. And his whole thing is, SQL is not rocket science. It's not hard. It's not complex. You just need to understand it. And by the time I left that contract, I'd been on it for 10 years. I could do left outer joins in my sleep, And so the idea is, if you think you're going to go in with JPA or Spring Data JPA based system and not have to understand what left outer join is, then that's delusion. And they're powerful if you understand what that is. So if you're coming to Spring One this year, towards the end of the year, come and find me and say, what the heck is a left outer join? Plug for the conference. So that was fun. We talked about JDBC Template. We talked about Spring Data JPA. What in the world is Spring Data JDBC? Because we've talked about how, I've humorously called it, I've seen it referred to as the abyss, that when you start going down into JPA, you have to learn more and more and more. And at some point you realize you know more about JPA than the next 10 people you know of that's worked with it. Kind of like, how did I get here? Because it seems like a never-ending thing. Like, sometimes it seems like it's too much. It's eating up all your time, and you avoid the nice circle of JPA. I like that. So, I'm trying to be lighthearted about it. It's a cool technology, but sometimes you don't need that level of detail. Sometimes people have said, I want this JDBC stuff, but I want it with the Spring Data repository approach to it. And that's what Spring Data JDBC is. I think it started about 5 years ago, and our teammate Jens Schauder is the lead for that. And so it's the idea of, is there something kind of in the middle between the two? So they started off fresh and said, what if we drop some of the assumptions you get with Hibernate or with JPA? The whole thing that JPA is going to manage absolutely everything, all the connections, all the relationships. What if the user kind of does that directly? How far can we get with the concept of Spring Data if we drop some of that stuff? And the answer is amazingly pretty far. And then I think it was also in 2018, it was either 2017 or 2018, when I saw Jens give his first talk at a spring conference about Spring Data JDBC. It filled the room. People were hungry for this kind of, I want JDBC. The other phenomena you run into is in Spring Data, in JPA, you're not writing the queries, you're writing the stuff. Second. You're not writing the query so much as you're writing JPQL. JPA translates it into Oracle, and if you turn on logging to see what query got written, you're kind of like, what the heck is that? I don't understand what that is. And we've had people come to us and say, this query is wrong, and we would look at it and we would say, well, actually that query is identical to what you're asking for. They both do the same thing, and if you run them through the explain plan, you can do that. So JPA was correct in that instance, but so people are like, want a sense of, give me the control back of JDBC. And so this is what Spring Data JDBC does. And it's really fascinating. It also has some of the benefits of, if you start fresh today, it doesn't have as much inertia or stuff. There's a lot of things that we're having to support, decisions that were made years ago. And Spring Data JDBC is a little fresher, a little lighter, and it's pretty cool. So you may want to go take a peek at that and see if, before you pick up the Sledgehammer or Spring Data JPA, maybe this is the one for you.
Can I tell you my favorite feature of Spring Data JDBC? You can use records with it. So if you're on the latest versions of Java, you can use records, cut down all of that ceremony of your domain models. That's my favorite part.
I've heard all I need to hear. I've honestly never taken Spring Data JDBC for a spin, and yeah, that's what I need to hear.
I will say I'm still pretty new to it. I think one of the things that I'm still trying to wrap my head around is relationships, because in the JPA world, I'm used to modeling one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many, with some annotation, mapping to some other domain model. And I haven't really figured that out in the Spring Data JDBC world yet. It's not a lack of documentation, or it's just a lack of trying. I haven't got there yet, but that's my next kind of hurdle with Spring Data JDBC.
So, and so now that we've covered the big three, then if I tell you what this stuff is, this probably should be kind of straightforward. So R2DBC template is just, in building Spring Data R2DBC, we had some common operations we kept using over and over. So Mark Paluk refactored that. Mark Paluk, the current lead for the Spring Data team, he refactored it into a R2DBC template, if you will, a workhorse to carry out R2DBC oriented operations, and that got put into the Spring framework. Now there's some R2DBC, there's reactor stuff in Spring framework, and so it's essentially if you want to talk to a relational database and reactive paradigm, you may not want to go straight to R2DBC because it's kind of low level. R2DBC is the thing that says you don't need to do the dance, you don't need to do the stuff there. Instead, you reactively submit your query, do your row mapping pattern, and so it lets you do that, but that everything is reactive, underneath it, all the way to the database. So, for the slim margin of people that need to go do that kind of gory stuff, there you go, you got it. And if you've already seen JDBC template, JDBC template was my first love. That was the thing that pulled me into Spring framework. When I saw that, I'm like, what is this thing? And I started looking, I'm like, wow. So you know what that is, and then you can probably maybe kind of sort of guess what Spring Data R2DBC is. It's like Spring Data JDBC, but for R2DBC. Now, you try to say that many letters all at once, like the space-time continuum may implode. But anyway, the Spring Data R2DBC, that and Spring Data JDBC have a common parent project called Spring Data Relational. So there's aspects of if you learn one of these, the other one's going to kick in pretty well, because the way they handle queries, the way they do parsing and stuff like that, it's kind of the same thing between those two projects. Is there going, the other question I get all the time is when is Spring Data JPA going to support Reactor? And the answer is absolutely never, because JPA is not reactive. And my side hustle of running Spring Web Services, people are asking me when is the SOAP stuff going to support reactive? I say never, because no SOAP third-party library is ever going to speak reactive. So hopefully this sheds some light on what these things do. It's to bring to you the power to do the stuff. And in all these toolkits, there's escape hatches, because in a sense that we can use query, we can talk about query derivation, these finder methods. We can talk about query by example, but sometimes you need to use it. But in the repository, this one method, I want to stuff in that query that joins 20 tables. Well, just about every module, Spring Data module, has an @ query annotation. You can stick on a method and just put your own query. And if the count query for that supports paging is different, you can go, there's a field for that in that annotation. So you can also, at any point in time in your app, when you're using Spring Data JPA, say, I need an auto-wired copy of the entity manager. Just give me the entity manager. I'll talk to it myself, for better or worse. So we give you the hooks. It's all sitting there in the app context, and you do what you need to do to get your job done. And we don't want to be the ones that get in the way, because that just makes for bad press, right?
This has been good. This has been good for
Yep.
me.
Yep. I think, we had a similar conversation at a Spring One tour stop last week about testing. There's just so many options to testing in the Spring world, so many annotations, so many guides, so many different libraries. Sometimes it's hard to get started because you're not sure, like, what are these things? When do I reach for one or the other? So the same kind of goes with Spring Data. The Spring Data project is very big. There are all these different things that you talked about today. So I think the first step is really just, as you said, kind of understanding what each of these things do. Now that you know that, now you know at least which one to reach for and start learning that particular thing. So this was great. Thank you.
If your skill set is if you've been working with JPQL for years, then it should be, to me, a natural fit to just reach for Spring Data JPA. You're coming over from something where you've been writing SQL for years, that maybe Spring Data JDBC is the place to start at for you, for example. And this is some of the stuff I like to, I like to put this kind of content on my channel, and go visit my channel, Spring Boot Learning. And so I want to put stuff to show that. I've got stuff showing how to test stuff. One of the questions is, well, if I'm going to use this, how do I test my app using it? And there's different strategies.
Yep.
The next episode of Spring Office Hours is writing itself. So you can dive on testing stuff.
It sure is. Yep. Cool. Well, I know we've still got a bunch of people here in chat. Does anybody have any questions for Greg, or?
There's one question I'm not sure that we answered. I'm going to take a quick stab at it. Making sure that the options that are in the query by example are from a list. And yeah, you can implement that. You can, in your implementation where you're grabbing those fields from your UI, you can validate that. That's easy. And you can also populate your UI by doing a query of those things that you wanted to grab from the table. Yeah, that's definitely a case. I think I understand where you're going with that question. Hey, I want to make sure that my dropdown only has this list in, and make sure I'm only querying by, or maybe I only query by some subset of the things. But yeah, those are all possibilities. I hope I answered that. But yeah, this is the time where, like I like to say, like, if you leave here and you still have questions, that's on you. We're here to answer your questions. Greg, thank you so much. You did a great job. I learned stuff, so I hope somebody along the way, I'm sure we answered a couple of the questions. And yeah, this is the time where we want this to be an office hours. We want it to be interactive, and bring your questions. And it doesn't have to be around Spring Data. What are you working on? We might not have the answers, but we have Slack, and we can get people like Greg to come here and answer.
Yeah. Yeah, so in every office hours, we always talk that, hey, if you ask us questions and we don't have answers, there are people we can Slack. Greg is one of those people.
Yeah. And if not, that's
Cool.
okay. If there's no questions, that is absolutely okay. We appreciate everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.
All right. Thanks again, Greg. Thanks to Sean. Have a good one, everyone.